Once upon a time in a small village of Okosi, there was a young girl named Amoka. Amoka lived with her father, Mr. Obi, and her kind mother, who loved her dearly. They were a happy family, always laughing and enjoying their time together. One day, Amoka's mother fell ill and went to be with the stars in the sky. Mr. Obi was very sad but decided to remarry to provide Amoka with a motherly figure. He married a woman named Mrs. Nena, who seemed very kind at first. Mrs. Nena moved into their home with her 2 children, Chuka and Oge. They appeared friendly, and Amoka hoped they would become her friends. However, things began to change once the wedding festivities were over. Mrs. Nena's kind face turned into one of coldness. Amoka noticed that Mrs. Nena started treating her differently. At breakfast, Mrs. Nena would give Amoka only a small piece of bread while Chuka and Oge got much more. When it was time for chores, Amoka was always given the hardest tasks, like scrubbing the floors and cleaning the bathrooms, while Chuka and Oge played. One day, as Amoka was cleaning the kitchen, Mrs. Nene came in with a stern look. "Amoka," she said, "you've left the kitchen too messy. You will not eat dinner tonight." Amoka's heart sank. She worked very hard, and the kitchen was spotless. But there was no use arguing. She went to bed hungry that night, while Chuka and Oge enjoyed a hearty meal. Amoka tried her best to stay positive and continue with her chores. She hoped that if she was good and did her work well, Mrs. Nena would start treating her better. But things only got worse. Mrs. Nena started telling lies about Amoka to Mr. Obi, saying she was lazy and misbehaved, which was far from the truth. One rainy afternoon, Amoka was given the task of washing clothes outside in the cold rain. She shivered as she scrubbed and rinsed. Chuka and Oge watched from the window, laughing at her predicament. Mrs. Nena stood by the door, shaking her head in satisfaction. As the days went by, Amoka's sadness grew. She missed her mother so much and wished for a day when the family would be happy again. She hoped for a miracle that would change their lives and bring back the joy she once knew. One evening, after another long day of harsh treatment, Amoka sat quietly in her room, feeling very alone. Little did she know that her troubles were about to take a new turn. The night brought with it a stormy wind that shook the windows and rattled the doors. As Amoka lay in bed, trying to sleep, she heard a faint knock on her door. Curious and hopeful, she went to open it, wondering who could be visiting at such a late hour. She found a mysterious old woman standing in the doorway, holding a lantern that cast a warm, flickering light. The old woman looked at Amoka with kind eyes and said, "I have come to help you, my child. Your suffering will soon come to an end." Amoka's heart raced with a mix of fear and excitement. She wondered what this stranger could possibly mean. The old woman continued, "There is a way to change your fate, but it requires courage and wisdom. Are you ready to take a chance?" Amoka looked into the old woman's eyes and nodded. "Yes, I am ready. I will do whatever it takes to end this pain." The old woman smiled and handed Amoka a small, ornate box. "This box holds the key to your freedom. But remember, it is not the box itself, but the choices you make with it that will determine your future." Amoka took the box and watched as the old woman disappeared into the night, leaving her with a glimmer of hope. As the storm raged outside, Amoka clutched the box tightly, wondering what secrets it might hold and how it would change her life. She knew one thing for certain: things were about to get very interesting, and she needed to be ready for whatever was coming next. Amoka held the box tightly, wondering what it could mean. She decided to hide it under her bed and think about it the next day. The storm raged on outside, but in her heart, a small spark of hope had been lit. The next morning, Amoka woke up early and went to her chores as usual. Mrs. Nena was already awake, backing orders and making sure Amoka had no moment to rest. Chuka and Oge were playing, laughing, and enjoying their morning. Amoka wondered how she could ever use the box with Mrs. Nena watching her every move. Days turned into weeks, and Amoka continued to suffer under her stepmother's cruelty. She was given the hardest chores, the smallest portions of food, and the coldest corner of the house to sleep in. Mr. Obi was often away for work, and when he was home, Mrs. Nena filled his ears with lies about Amoka's behavior. One day, as Amoka was cleaning the attic, she found an old diary that belonged to her late mother. She opened it and read the loving words her mother had written about her. Tears filled her eyes as she remembered the warmth and kindness her mother had always shown. It gave her strength to endure Mrs. Nena's wickedness. That night, when everyone was asleep, Amoka took the box from under her bed. She opened it carefully and found a small, shiny key inside. There was also a note that read, "This key will open the door to your freedom. Use it wisely." Amoka wondered what door the key could open. She decided to keep it with her and wait for the right moment. She hid the box and key in a small pouch she wore around her neck, always keeping it close. The next morning, Mrs. Nena noticed the pouch around Amoka's neck. "What's that?" she demanded, eyes narrowing suspiciously. "It's just a small pouch, Mama," Amoka replied, trying to sound calm. "It belonged to my mother." Mrs. Nena snatched the pouch from Amoka's neck and opened it. She found the box and the key inside. "What is this?" she asked, her voice filled with anger and curiosity. "It's just an old box, Mama." "It doesn't mean anything," Amoka said, hoping Mrs. Nena would believe her. Mrs. Nena didn't believe her. She took the box and key and hid them away, thinking they might be valuable. Amoka's heart sank. She felt as if her last hope had been taken away. Mrs. Nena's treatment of Amoka grew even harsher. She made her work from dawn till dusk without rest. Amoka's hands became rough and sore from all the hard work. She was given less food and water, making her weak and tired. Chuka and Oge teased her, calling her names and laughing at her misery. One day, Amoka was scrubbing the floor when she felt dizzy and faint. She hadn't eaten properly in days, and her body was exhausted. She fell to the ground, unable to get up. Mrs. Nena found her lying there and sneered, "Get up, you lazy girl. There's no time to rest." But Amoka couldn't move. She lay there, feeling helpless and alone. Mrs. Nena dragged her to her room and locked the door. "You'll stay there until you learn to walk properly," she said, leaving Amoka in the dark, cold room. Amoka lay on her bed, shivering and weak. She prayed for strength and hoped that someone would come to help her. Days passed, and she grew weaker. She could hear Chuka and Oge playing outside, their laughter mocking her pain. One evening, Mrs. Nene came into the room with a bowl of soup. She had a strange look in her eyes. "Here, eat this," she said, placing the bowl on the table. Amoka was too weak to question it. She drank the soup, hoping it would give her some strength. But instead of feeling better, Amoka felt worse. Her stomach hurt, and she felt dizzy. She realized too late that the soup had been poisoned. Mrs. Nena watched her suffer, a cruel smile on her face. Amoka's world began to fade. She thought of her mother, of the kind old woman who had given her the box, and of the hope she once had. Her last thoughts were of freedom, something she never got to taste. Mr. Obi returned home the next day to find his daughter gone. He was heartbroken. He couldn't understand how this could happen. Mrs. Nena pretended to be sad, but inside, she felt victorious. She had gotten rid of Amoka and could now focus on her own children. But Mrs. Nena's victory was short-lived. Guilt began to eat at her, and she started to have terrible nightmares. She saw Amoka's face everywhere, haunting her. She heard Amoka's cries in the wind, begging for justice. One night, as Mrs. Nena was sleeping, she had a dream. In the dream, the old woman who had given Amoka the box appeared. "Your wickedness has been seen, and you will pay for your sins," the old woman said. "You took an innocent life, and now, you will face the consequences." Mrs. Nena woke up screaming. She ran out of the house, her mind filled with fear and guilt. She ran through the streets, tearing at her clothes and hair, screaming about the ghosts that were after her. People watched in shock as she ran, not understanding what had happened. Mrs. Nena's mind was lost. She could no longer tell what was real and what was a nightmare. She wandered the streets, talking to herself and crying out for forgiveness. No one could help her, and she was left to suffer the madness she had brought upon herself. Mr. Obi, heartbroken and alone, finally learned the truth. He discovered the box and key that Mrs. Nena had taken from Amoka. The old woman appeared to him as well, explaining what had happened and how Amoka had suffered. Mr. Obi wept for his daughter and the pain she had endured. Amoka's story spread through the city, and people spoke of her bravery and kindness. They remembered her as a girl who had suffered greatly but never lost her spirit. The story of her stepmother's wickedness and eventual madness served as a lesson to all. In the end, Amoka's spirit found peace. Her story became a reminder of the power of kindness and the consequences of cruelty. The village of Okosi never forgot her, and her memory lived on in the hearts of those who knew her tale. Moral lessons from the story. 1. Treat others with kindness. It is important to be kind to everyone, especially those who are in a difficult situation. Cruelty and wickedness can cause great harm and bring sorrow to everyone involved. 2. Truth will come out. Lies and bad deeds cannot be hidden forever. In the end, the truth will be known, and those who do wrong will face the consequences of their actions. Bible verse to learn from this story. Proverbs 11 verse 21. Be sure of this, the wicked will not go unpunished, but those who are righteous will go free.